Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is continue to look at theory during the Middle Years, but now turn our attention to European social thought. And in doing so, we'll be looking at two different theorists today, Walter Benjamin and Antonio Gramsci. And so keep in mind here, as I say kind of in the slide, we're building on a thread that already exists. So when the American social thought during the Middle Years, they were creating a new thread. Here, what we're looking at during the Middle Years, people continuing a thread that already existed, that existed in the classical theory section of our class. So what we're looking at is called neo-Marxism. So basically, people continuing the ideas of Marx and Engels. Back in our section, the classical theory. And not only are they continuing the ideas of Marx and Engels, but they're also employing some ideas of other classical theorists as well. So you see a focus on culture, which ties back into Durkheim, and you see a focus on status and a focus on power, and you see that being connected to Weber. So we start to see as the Marxist tradition being carried on, especially kind of that shift back to capitalism as that driving force in reality. But also we see them kind of pulling on other classical theory threads, specifically looking at Weber and looking at Durkheim as well, incorporating their ideas and their Marxist thought. And when we see, going back to Marxist thought, when we see going back to the other classical theorists, what we're seeing is a shift of focus from the micro level, what we saw with the American social thought, back to the macro level, what we saw in the classical theory section. And with this, we'll see a higher emphasis on those social structures that exist on the macro level. The focus on culture as a social structure, the focus on capitalism as a social structure, status as a social structure. We'll see all these things kind of be at the forefront of the theories that we're going to be discussing today. So here we're looking at kind of two main questions being asked. So, a lot of people during this time period would say, where is that revolution that Marx predicted in the Communist Manifesto? Where is that major shift to socialism as predicted in the theory? And so on the one hand, you do see this start to bubble up different times, different spaces. So, in the United States, you start to see, the organization of workers, the organization of unions, and through their fights against the capitalist, we have minimum wage laws, we have 5-day work weeks, we have, the weekend, we have Social Security, we have different standards when it comes to workplace health conditions, workplace safety conditions, public schools. So, all these things that kind of have the kind of government assistance in terms of mandating a certain minimum wage, supporting public education, starting at a young level through college. All these are kind of socialist programs, although we tend not to thinking about them as such. But again, all these kind of advances, according to Marx and Engels, were because workers came together and fought for the 5-day work week, the increased safety precautions at work. It wasn't because the capitalists were feeling benevolent. It was because the workers organized and fought for it. So we do see these elements of socialism emerging all over the world, just like Marx and Engels predicted. But we don't see kind of that major shift, away from capitalism to a more social society. And so what's stalling this evolution? Why is it taking longer than some people may think it should? Well, Marx and Engels would say, on the one hand, change is slow. Just like Durkheim, he believed that change takes time. There's always going to be, 2 steps forward, a step and a half backward. And so, it's going to take time. But, on the other hand, what these neo-Marxists are doing is starting to look at kind of other sources of oppression, other ways of kind of keeping the powers that be in their positions of power. And so here we start to shift away from simply looking at capitalism as a economic structure to now looking at other social structures such as culture, such as media, such as institutions like government and education, and how those things come together to contribute to the capitalist power, to the sustainability of capitalism as a mode of production. And so, and another kind of focus is, um, yeah, how can we resist? And so, and the second question is, how can we resist the system, not only through organization of the workers, but what are other forms of resistance that people can put forth to continue to kind of move forward in society? So that's what we're looking at there. We're looking at kind of new sources of control in both Benjamin and Gramsci's theories, but also new ways of resistance. So with Benjamin, we're looking at a cultural Marxist associated with the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was just a group of theorists who basically looked at what they call different cultural industries. Basically different organizations that produce cultural ways. The media being kind of a key focus for the Frankfurt School theorist. And keep in mind, during the middle years, the media is growing at a much faster rate compared to when Marx and Engels were writing, and the media has a much longer influential reach today during these middle years compared to the past. So then you kind of update the Marxist ideas to incorporate the role of media as an institution. And then also we can say that Gramsci is another cultural Marxist because, again, this focus on culture, like we saw with Durkheim, but putting that Marxist spin on it. And he's looking at cultural institutions too, but not looking at the institution of media like Benjamin, but looking at institutions of the government and institutions of education and how these institutions contribute to the capitalist system being able to reproduce itself, perpetuate itself. So let's start with Benjamin. So there's a lot going on here, and Benjamin's not the easiest read. Sometimes he's a little bit abstract, so it makes it difficult to kind of ground it. But it's very interesting ideas. Probably one of my favorite theorists that we go through in the semester. Benjamin, we're looking at a theory of social change. And so what hopefully comes to mind, if we're thinking about a neo-Marxist and we're thinking about a theory of social change, what should come to mind is the Communist Manifesto. So basically that's what we're seeing updated in one way or another. He's updating the Marxist idea of social change and how that connects to the mode of production in a society driving that change. So on the one hand, he's trying to explain that the disruption of cultural authority by new technology during these times. So basically looking at new technological advances that take the power away from the upper class, from the capitalist, and put power now into the hands of the workers, the working class. So now what we see, kind of getting to the how part, so how does this work? Well, during this time period, and we can generalize this to today as well, we have new ways to produce culture. So in the past, those who kind of own the means of production, the printing presses, the publishing companies, the news corporations, the entertainment industry, basically, those are all dominated by the capitalist class. You own the companies and you produced what was out there. But now what we start to see, new technology starts to let non-capitalist class members, workers, produce their own cultural ways. So, we could think about it today in terms of, iPhones, the internet, blogging, all these kind of forms of producing new ideas, new ways of thinking are out there, and they're not controlled by the capitalist class. The working class can easily get their hands on these technological innovations, and they can use the technologies to produce new cultural ways to challenge established cultural ways. So that's what's going on here. During this time period, you have higher access to film, to cameras, to recording devices, printing devices, and now the availability of this technology on the one hand allows the masses to create culture. But on the other hand, why the availability is there to begin with is because the capitalist class is trying to make money. So, the film, the recording devices, the printing devices, They're all out there for the masses to buy and to consume so the capitalist class can make money. But, on the other hand, the capitalist class can use these devices the working class can use these devices that the capitalist class do profit off of. They can use these devices to challenge cultural authority and produce their own culture. So that goes back to the Communist Manifesto and how the capitalist system basically sets itself up for its own failure. So here, there's kind of two angles to this. So on the one hand, a lot of people tend to focus on the disruption of cultural aura. So basically, Benjamin talks about when you have the ability to reproduce culture, to reproduce words, images, the reproductions do something to the original. The original has this kind of special quality to it. It's kind of the fetishized quality that we talked about earlier in the semester. This kind of aura that exists in the original. The original exists in kind of a time and place, and with that existence, has some magic kind of provided to it. So, it's like going to a museum. I remember the first time I went to, I've looked at pictures of the Mona Lisa, the painting before, and, it never really did anything for me. Like, okay, it looks pretty boring. But then I actually saw the original when I was visiting Paris, and it was special. Like, I was like, wow, this is actually pretty cool. I'm glad, I actually went to see it because I really didn't plan on seeing it because I didn't think I needed to. But seeing kind of the original, it had this kind of aura and this kind of magic it has over you kind of as the viewer. You're a witness to something special. And I think about live music in a similar way. And it's one thing to watch a clip on YouTube or listen to a record that's been recorded, so a copy of something, rather than seeing kind of the original in its time and in its place. When you actually go to a concert, it has much more of kind of a magical feeling compared to listening to a copy of the music in your car, on your headphones, or again, on your computer. So that's what we're looking at. And, so when you make these copies, the wow factor of the original almost disappears. It becomes minimized. And Benjamin says it does this because now, as a viewer, we have more time to think about kind of what we're listening to because we can listen to it again. We have more time to look at something because, there are no museum hours that we have to abide by. So when we can really concentrate on listening and seeing the reproductions, then we can start to critique it. We start to see through some of the fetishism that we give it, see through some of that aura, and start to critique what's going on in the artifact, whether it be something we're watching, something we're looking at, or something we're reading, or something we're listening to. And so, I gave a couple examples in terms of, how we can think about this. But, one way I think about it often is, when I do a lecture in kind of real time, real space, I kind of just go with the flow when I do it. And, at the end of the day, typically I say, that went okay, that went well. But when I'm doing these recordings, I easily catch myself messing up. If I go back and watch a lecture that I did, if I go back and listen to a lecture that I did, I can catch all these errors. I can think about what I could have done differently, what I could improve on. And that's because, again, I'm kind of taking myself outside of the original and starting to critique a copy of the original, a reproduction of the lecture. So again, you shift away from being kind of a viewer in awe, being caught in that time and space, to more of the critic, kind of looking at something and critiquing it. And then, another way I think about this is, everyday life that I'm looking at my hands, they're fine. There's a regular set of hands. But if I ever, like in class, if I look at an overhead kind of copy of my hand, so if I'm putting up like a picture on the overhead for classes, I'll catch my hand, on the screen. And, it's horrible, so I start to see a copy of my hand rather than my hand as it is. And then I start to look at it differently. I critique it rather than just saying, it's a hand. So again, once we start to look at copies of things, reproductions of things, You start to listen to them a little bit differently, see them differently. And again, we're more the critic rather than somebody who's kind of in awe of the moment. And what that does, again, it kind of disrupts that cultural authority that the capitalist class, that the ruling class kind of had over the workers when you couldn't have your hands-on reproductions. All you had to do was see the original because reproductions did not exist yet. And so that's kind of one part. You start to disrupt the power because you start to critique it more and recognize it as something that perhaps isn't so powerful. But on the other hand, as I kind of alluded to earlier, with this new technology that allows you to reproduce culture, you can start to create new culture, a new culture that kind of provides alternative cultural ways, new ways of thinking, and it can challenge the status quo. So here's the resistance part. So on the one hand, you start to recognize media as a form of power, and when it's only controlled by the powers that be. And now you see the media being a tool of resistance. When the workers can get their hand on it, they can make their own newspapers, they can make their own magazines, and they can make their own films. And with that, you start to challenge and counter the established cultural ways. And so again, you see this going on a lot today with a lot of the current social movements going on. You may not see it kind of on the big time stations or in the big time movies, but if you search, you can definitely find people creating these new cultural ways, these new ways of thinking by using these new forms of technology that we have out there. And again, the technology, the computer, the applications on our phones, all these things are there to make profit. iPhones make a lot of money. The applications make a lot of money. The computers make money. But on the other hand, people are using these things that create profit to challenge the system as a whole. So again, what we're looking at is the promotion of social change, and the change itself is kind of set up by the system itself, just like Marx and Engels talked about in the Communist Manifesto. So we're turning our attention to the second theory for today, Gramsci's piece. And here we're looking at a theory of social control. So again, hopefully what comes to mind, if you think about it for a second, we're looking at a theory of social control. We're looking at a neo-Marxist theorist. So the German ideology should come to mind. So basically that's what we're looking at here. And they call it hegemony. And hegemony is similar to ideology, a little bit different, but basically they, kind of a shared culture. But hegemony is more about kind of a common sense that's part of a larger culture, or at least a claim on common sense. So what we're looking at here is how hegemony, kind of a cultural common sense, is created by intellectuals. And so Gramsci looks at two main institutions, one connected to civil society, the institution of education. During this time period, education has grown dramatically, no longer reserved for the upper class, but now basically, the masses are part of the education within a society. And we're looking at the institution of government, the state as well, and how the government in education come together to produce what he calls organic intellectuals. And so organic intellectuals basically are people who have credentials granted by the institution. So your schools provide you the degrees, and with these degrees, you start to get a sense of legitimacy in the eyes, in the minds of other people. So, before I became the PhD, the doctor, I could be saying a lot of things, but, most people wouldn't listen to me. But once I get that doctor before my name and the PhD after my name, then I have a sense of legitimacy that I lacked before. And with that sense of legitimacy that comes with the credential, more people will take what you say seriously, more people will lend you their ear. So you see that, MDs, the lawyers, all these people that are credentialed through education becoming kind of part of the organic intellectuals. And the same thing is through government. So through your participation in government, you are credentialed as the press secretary, the representative, the senator, and with all these kind of credentials and labels you acquire within the government, again, you're getting a sense of legitimacy that you wouldn't have without the labels, without the credentials. And with these, credentials, you gain this legitimacy again that makes people kind of listen to you compared to the alternative. And so when these people are kind of going through the system, basically, you're really not taught anything new. In school, you really don't learn about alternative ways of organizing society. In school, you really don't learn kind of new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. You may, learn about different spins on things that already exist, but nobody is really advocating kind of a shift to a socialist society. I never took that class in college. Nobody is advocating in governments to totally change the capitalist system. Basically, they're trying to tweak it in one way or another. And so, what you start to see is when you come through the system, and if you want to graduate, if you want to get elected, basically you have to reproduce it. If you're too challenging, you're not going to graduate. If you're too challenging, you're not going to get elected. And so basically, when you kind of come through the system, you become the system as a result, again, in different degrees, but you become a part of the system and you reproduce it, as, through your ideas. So, the politicians may have different views in terms of policy, but again, the politicians are not calling for these large dramatic changes. So you're simply reproducing the capitalist system. And the same thing with the educator. The educator is not advocating in the classroom for the students, changing the system as a whole, maybe tweaking it a little bit, but not changing it. And what you're going to do ultimately is reproduce it. So you're producing these cultural ways in the governments, in education, that lend themselves to the capitalist system reproducing itself, remaining the system as a whole. And so what you're looking at, two kind of new institutions besides the economy that perpetuate capitalism as a whole, but also Gramsci believes that these institutions are much more effective at reproducing capitalism because nobody believes a teacher has a horse in the race, a dog in the fight. So they see them as being more kind of objective compared to the capitalist. So if you own a business and you're advocating for certain laws or against certain laws, it's easy to kind of sniff it out. Of course you're going to want that law or be against that law because that's going to hurt your bottom line. We're not so suspicious of the educator. So we see them as being more objective. We're not so suspicious of the politician. So we see them as being more objective. Compared to the capitalist, we can be a little suspicious because of course you're going to think that way because you're always going to want what is best for your bottom line. So again, these appear to be more distant from the system, but nevertheless, they contribute the education, the government, they contribute to the system reproducing itself as a whole. So like we saw in Benjamin, kind of looking at new forms of power, but also we can say a new form of resistance. So within these channels, government and education, it is possible to have what he calls revolutionary intellectuals. They're, a dime a dozen compared to the organic intellectuals who simply reproduce the status quo. But every once in a while, we can see, somebody who's a professor or somebody who's a politician that does challenge the system. So they get elected, they get hired at a university, and rather than reproducing the status quo, they challenge it. And this challenging of the status quo is important because these revolutionary intellectuals carry the credentials that give them legitimacy. They have the PhDs, they're a senator for their state. And so you listen to their ideas more seriously compared to somebody who's challenging the system, but simply doesn't have the credential that gains them the legitimacy in the eyes of the public. So here's a new way to resist. And just like using the technology that Benjamin talked about, Gramsci says we can use these revolutionary intellectuals who carry the credentials to be taken seriously, but what comes out of their mouth challenges the system rather than reproducing it. So again, kind of the German ideology is a driving force, going back to capitalism, needs a system that, or needs a culture that reproduces the system. And the two institutions of education and government kind of lend itself to creating that ideology, that hegemonic way of thought But again, you do see resistance as possible when you have the revolutionary intellectuals. So, a longer class today because we had a lot to get in. But again, two interesting theories putting a cultural Marxist spin on earlier Marxist thought.